This video is an excerpt from one of the Master Series videos I uploaded to Patreon. Today we're going to discuss 3 different ways to shellac pallet stone. In part 1, we learned about all the different actions between the pallet stones and the escape wheel tooth. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, you're going to want to watch that first so that the adjustment process makes sense to you. Okay, now that you understand the difference between lock, total lock, slide and drop, you can use that knowledge in order to place the stones correctly in the pallet slots, or even to make adjustments to correct clearance faults within the escapement. Fortunately, pallet stone adjusting is one of the high-level repairs that really doesn't require a big investment in tools and supplies. What it does require, though, is knowledge, which can easily be learned in this video series. Now, before you can adjust any stones, let's go over some of the methods of work you're going to need to know. The first question that you probably have is, do I just melt the existing shellac or do I apply new shellac? And the answer is it really depends. If the shellac is in good condition and you're making the adjustment by pushing the stone in, then sometimes just heating the pallet and making the adjustment works fine. But I think you're going to find in most cases that the shellac will be covering the end of the stone in the slot, so you're going to end up damaging the shellac. So I usually recommend just removing the stone, cleaning up the pallet, and then re-shellacking the stone after your adjustments have been made. When you're cleaning the pallets and stones, if you are readjusting both pallet stones, you can just remove the bulk by just soaking the whole pallet fork in denatured alcohol. Now, IPA will work, but I do find that denatured alcohol is a little bit more aggressive when you want to remove all the shellac very quickly. Now, if you're only adjusting one stone, obviously you don't want to soak the whole pallet fork. What I like to do is heat my hairspring needling tool to scrape off the bulk of the shellac. I just made this one with a sewing needle, which is mounted in pegwood. I heated the tip in order to bend it over, and then I filed it down to about 2/100th of a millimeter, and then I polished it. You'll find that when you heat the tip, you will see it go cherry red in only about 5 seconds. And you can use it to scrape off the shellac on and around the stone. Now, once most of the shellac is removed, I put a drop of IPA on the area and then gently maneuver the stone to get it out of the slot. But you want to be very careful because too much force will chip the stone and then you'll have to find a replacement. Then you can clean up the rest of the area by going back and forth with a Q-tip dipped in denatured alcohol or IPA. I use a balance screw pin vise to hold the pallet while I'm cleaning it, but you can also just lay it on a bench block with the pivot in a small hole. The pallet stone itself can be soaked in alcohol, then scrubbed clean with a sharpened piece of pegwood or a Q-tip with alcohol. To handle the stone, I find it easiest to use 2 sets of fine tweezers to turn it over while detailing out each side. You want them clean from the old shellac, but this is not going to be the final cleaning, so don't go crazy. That's going to be done after the stone has been finally shellacked permanently. To shellac pallet stones, you're going to need a pallet warmer to secure the pallet fork when you're heating it. Here are 3 examples that I use. The first is made of brass and may be the most common style that you're going to find on eBay. You'll notice that the warmer is split down the middle. That's to allow one side of the pallet to get hot enough to melt the shellac without melting the shellac on the other pallet. The pallet is held in place by this lever, which goes on the opposite side of the pivot of the stone you're heating. Now, the problem with this style of warmer, and others as well, is that the hold down is not really strong enough to hold the pallet fork when you're pushing on the stone. What you can do is use two sharpened pieces of pegwood, one to prevent the pallet from moving and one to push on the stone. It works, but it's going to be a little awkward to do. The second one is just a variation of the brass holder. This warmer has a steel table, but works in the same way. It does have less of a split, so it doesn't really isolate the heat from the pallet as well, but that's usually not really a problem as it cools down pretty fast, and that locks the unmoved pallet stone in its place. Now, this third type is what I go to when I need to adjust pallet stones. It has an aluminum body, which is okay, but the biggest difference is that it locks the pallet fork in place. Not only does it lock the pallet fork, but the two pivoting arms are angled to fit flat over the impulse plane, so as soon as it comes off the heat, you can make the adjustment. Now, it does have a graduated scale, but I find it pretty much useless under a microscope, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Now, there's a couple different methods to apply shellac to the pallet stones. So I'm going to show you a couple different ways that you can try to determine which method works best for you. I usually use a combination of two different methods. Shellac has a melting point of 167 degrees or 75 degrees Celsius. The two biggest challenges when working with shellac is its short opening time for being able to work on it before it hardens, which is really only about 10 seconds, and the small amount that you need to apply to the stone to hold it in place. If there's too much shellac on the stone, it can interfere with your divisions and drag on the main plate. The first thing you need to be able to do is heat the shellac to the melting point. This can be done with a spirit lamp or by using a hot plate. The advantage of the spirit lamp is the low cost of the lamp and fuel, and the fact that it comes to temperature right away. The disadvantage is that if you use the wrong fuel, they can produce a lot of black soot, which you will need to clean off the pallets once the shellac is hardened. I have found that denatured alcohol burns pretty clean, and with about a 1-inch flame, there is almost no residue at all. Now, you can also use a good quality hot plate, which produces a more controlled heat without the worry of any soot at all. But if you're going to use a hot plate, it should have a variable control, and you'll need to be able to measure the heat coming off its surface. The disadvantage to a hot plate is that a good one can be pretty expensive, and they take longer to heat up. Now, in this demonstration, I'm going to be using the spirit lamp today because it's what I use and it's what I know best. The shellac you want to get is known as de-waxed blonde shellac flake, and it has a dark amber color to it. Now, I have a 4-ounce jar, and it'll last me a lifetime. So when you're looking at shellac, there's really no need to buy it in a large quantity. To prepare the shellac, you can just hold a piece with your tweezers, heat it over the spirit lamp, and when you see it just start to bubble, take another pair of fine tweezers and just grab into the melted bubble and slowly pull it away. Now, if you go too fast, the string will be too thin. You are really aiming for a string about half the width of the jewel that you're going to be setting. Now, to apply the shellac to the clean stone and pallet, you just break off a small piece of the string and lay it on the top back end of the jewel. And then you heat it up for about 10 seconds or so on the lamp. The goal is for the shellac to flow out flat on the jewel, draping over the sides of the stone onto the pallet, filling in the gaps between the stone and the pallet, locking it in place. The shellac will be a little sticky, so you can use a sharpened toothpick to move it around to get it in position. Looking at the shellac as it comes off the heat, you can see that the upper part of the stone looks a little light. So I'm just going to move a little bit over to the other side and then put it back on the heat for a couple seconds so that it all flows back out. There. Now we have good coverage, and that will hold the stone in place. The second way to apply shellac with heat is the way I like to do it, and it's kind of like soldering a copper pipe. I leave the shellac thread on the tweezers. I heat up the pallet to temperature, and then I just touch the string on the stone to deposit the shellac, and then heat it up for another 3 or 4 seconds so that it flows out. Once it's cooled off, I can check the coverage, make sure it's flowed out flat, and now I can take it off and it can be cleaned and installed into the movement. The third way to shellac pallet stones is to start by dissolving about 3 or 4 teaspoons of shellac in denatured alcohol. This jar has about 4 tablespoons of shellac flakes, which I've dissolved. Many times the pallet stone is going to be too loose to stay in the slot when you're making adjustments to it. I like to use the thin top layer inside the jar and apply it to the pallet slot in order to lock the stone in place while I'm making the adjustments. It dries really fast and it securely holds the stone while you're checking your adjustments, but it melts fast when you need to move the stone in or out. Once the adjustments are made, then you can just use an oiler to transfer more fresh liquid shellac to the stone. And then once there's enough shellac on the stone, you just put it on the heat and allow it to flow out. This method is awesome, and it gives you the most control on how much shellac is being used. You can see that the shellac is still a little soft when I push down on it, but I could put it back on the heat for a couple seconds and it just flows right back out. This is the method that I like to use almost all the time because I have more control over how much shellac I'm actually putting on the stone. This video is made possible from all my friends on Patreon who support what I'm doing here. This video is actually part of a 3-part series about setting pallet stones that I've uploaded exclusively for my patrons in our Master Series videos. In this series, we discuss all the interactions between the escape wheel teeth and the pallet stones, how to adjust the pallet stone in a fixed banking movement. In the third video I'm working on right now is we're going to be taking an old pocket watch with no pallet stones and with the banking pins out of adjustment, and we're going to go through the entire process of bringing that movement back to life. Look, if you've never attempted to re-shellac a pallet stone before, this is one of those skills that is really pretty easy to learn with just a little practice. I encourage you to get an experimental movement or some generic pallet forks and give it a try. If you work on these techniques and practice what I showed you today, not only will it be a confidence booster because you're getting out of your comfort zone, but it will make you a better watchmaker.